Subscribe to Feminism in India for your dose of intersectional feminist content and make sure to hit the bell icon to get all the latest updates.
Hi everyone, I'm Nishtha.
And for the final time, I am Pragya.
No, don't say that. Okay. We're your hosts for this season of Intersectional Feminism Desi Style, brought to you by Feminism in India. Pragya may have given you a bit of an insight, but we're going to get to that more later. But yes, I do want to say that this is the last episode of this season, and we're really excited to talk today.
Yes, and what we are talking about is something really important and crucial at this moment, given that the current state of affairs in India is not that great, as we can see on Twitter and otherwise. We have been witnessing growth in divisions across, say, different communities in India, and the trans community too has been on the receiving end of various anti minority laws, communal hatred, and obviously the highly problematic trans bill. Then again, we had the pandemic, and there was a deliberate neglect towards trans people and a general sense of hostility towards them. So in such a situation, I think that as a person from a non-trans community, it becomes very important to be better allies and join the trans rights movement in whatever capacity possible. um, we must try to create more spaces for dialogue and generate sensitivity towards the trans rights issues. But at the same time, we also mustn't speak on behalf of the community like we often see in Bollywood these days. So there are obviously many nuances to the trans rights movement, and one of the biggest one is the fact that trans people are not defined solely by their trans identity, but they live within various intersectionality of identities. They have caste, class, religion, all of these identities which to affect their lives and their everyday experiences. So we need to have this comprehensive understanding of the trans rights movement, and our resistance must not be, say, limited to all the Twitter talk. And so today we are going to talk about how to become better allies for the trans rights movement. And we have a very special guest with us today.
We are very excited and honored to invite on our podcast show today Jamal Siddiqui. He's a trans man and describes himself as a nerd, at least that's what his Feminism in India author post says. He's the co founder of Transmen Collective, and activism and writing are some of his favorite hobbies. He believes in queer feminism, is an animal lover, and a YouTuber. Thank you so very much, Jamal, for being here with us on the show today.
Hi everyone.
So, like I mentioned before, that I mean, our country has been discriminatory towards trans people for as long as one can remember. And I do not know, Jamal, if you feel the same, but I'm sure there are various experiences that you would like to share with us. And given that very recently there's also an increase in transphobia and trans negativity, and these things also have reflected on laws and policies, and in general trans people's everyday experiences. We want to know, where does intersectional feminism and trans rights activism meet in your life?
I think for me, intersectional feminism has been a savior for me, to be very honest. And in my life, it gives me understanding about whatever structures are there and whatever structural discrimination I've faced. And it also gave me awareness of my own stands in many ways. I think most of the people inside and outside community who hold the power in many sense made me and many people like me uh, feel that the discrimination which we face, the shortcoming or the being lagged behind, is our fault in some ways. But I think most of the time it is the privilege that other people hold that give them that natural push or easy access to the resources available. Um, So I understood these things, and it made me realize that the lack of confidence which I had comes from the fact that I am a minority and kind of have a minority stress. So coming to the trans activism, or I should say trans men activism, feminism is a rare sight. Like any other activist space, trans activism is also dominated by Hindu, upper class, able, upper caste, binary people, and many times it is dominated by male assigned at birth. Uh, so being Muslim, trans men, I find my peace in feminism. However, I do also find myself struggling. Like I also hold a lot of privileges like English speaking, able body, Muslim but yet upper caste, and so on. And also because in the recent times there has been a lot of growth in right wing trans activism, which is dominating the space right now. Yeah, personally the important lesson that I have learned is that equity is the solution and equal power distribution and giving voices to the people who are not being heard. So with TMC, that's what we are trying to do in our work also.
Thanks, Jamal. I think you bring up a really important discussion on how, even currently within, and this is something that we keep coming back to, Pragya, and I have come back to this a lot, is that even within so called liberal progressive circles, one finds that there is a certain amount of hegemony that comes with, like you mentioned, certain privileges, be they of being non-disabled or of being from a certain religion. And one almost saw these things get exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, we're almost coming now to a year of this, whatever this year has been. And the pandemic was a real shocker. But, as it progressed, and I'm especially talking when there was some sense of sort of being, some mystique and intrigue, and everybody was trying to find out what's going on. We saw that the same, marginalization and oppression that minorities in India faced, they only increased many folds during the lockdown and because of COVID-19 protocols. And one cannot actually sort of forget this sort of communal charge that had happened right in the beginning, where, for some reason, people found a way to make even this a communal incident. And there were rampant incidents of, violence and exclusion against trans people, against Muslims. So, can you elaborate for us a little bit? What were your experiences with the COVID-19 pandemic?
So I would start by sharing one experience which I had. So when this COVID lockdown things were in their early stages, so जब ये तबलीग जमात वाला whole thing was going on कि मुस्लिम कोविड फैला रहे हैं and all that. सो जब थोड़ा सा खुल गया था कोविड एंड देन जो व्हीकल ऑथराइज थे उनको एक्सेस था ट्रैवल करने का, सो वन ऑफ माय फ्रेंड जिनके कजिन बैंक में काम करते थे, उनका was the vehicle which was authorized to travel and all. So I had to travel from one place to another. So I asked my friend if he could help me out in that. So what happened was his mother said कि हम इसको नहीं लेके जाएंगे क्योंकि ये तो मुस्लिम है. एंड देन देयर वाज लॉट ऑफ थिंग्स शी सेड कि मुस्लिम है तो कोविड फैला देंगे और ये कर देंगे वो कर देंगे एंड ऐसा कर देंगे. Eventually, after a lot of fights, that cousin came to pick me up. But even in that whole journey, I could sense that uneasiness which he had. That also made me feel very weird. I mean, that was very uncomfortable for me as well. And also, like for instance, जैसे हम ट्रांसमेन कलेक्टिव में जब हम काम कर रहे थे जब कोविड के टाइम पे, सो वी हैड अ लॉट ऑफ केस. एक हमारे पास केस आया था फॉर जहाँ पे जब दिल्ली आई थिंक गवर्नमेंट जब फूड डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कर रही थी, सो देयर वाज दिस ट्रांस पर्सन जिनको उस लाइन में ही नहीं खड़ा होने दिया जा रहा था बिकॉज दे वर ट्रांस एंड दे वर इन अ वेरी बैड शेप. उनके पास रहने के लिए जगह नहीं थी, खाने के लिए कुछ नहीं था. And also a lot of trans people had to live with their families, which led to a lot of mental, emotional, physical violence. And one thing which we found very interesting in that whole thing was कि forced marriages, which was happening at that time. कि मतलब कोविड के टाइम पे भी लोगों को शादी की पड़ी थी. I mean, a lot of trans men approached us कि हमको जबरदस्ती शादी के लिए फोर्स किया जा रहा है या लड़के दिखाए जा रहे हैं. I mean, that was like another level of weirdness. And a lot of people also, because of these things, ran away from their families. And then they have to face a lot of money problems. मतलब पैसा नहीं था बिल्कुल भी लोगों के पास कुछ भी करने के लिए. So these are the problems which we came across in that COVID times.
Yeah, thank you, Jamal. I mean, we also received a lot of submissions from trans people who told us that once the lockdown was imposed, then they had to go back to their houses, which weren't that great places to live in because there was so much violence and trauma that they had experienced before. And when they started living outside the house, it was better because they were living with other people who understood where they came from, or even their friends and their community. So yeah, we also received a lot of these survivor stories with respect to the lockdown and what kind of impacts that it had on trans people. And moving on, I'll go back to your first answer about how you, I mean, you as a person from the trans community realize that you have had relative privileges over, say, other trans people. But like even the cishet community is so privileged, but they often falter in their language, actions, and their activism when it comes to, say, to show solidarity to the trans community. Um, of course, I'm not only talking about the recent Bollywood representation, or let's just call it misrepresentation, in the form of, say, Lakshmi Bomb and Pati Patni, or Panga, and all of these things, but also in very liberal feminist spaces. There is very little understanding of the trans rights movement. The power hierarchies that we have in our lives, the spaces for leadership and even in general community building, is very problematic, and you hardly find trans people in these development sectors or think tanks or the social sector, as we call it. So how do you think this can change?
I think no doubt that this cisgender heterosexual people control most of the spaces, and they are one of the biggest players in the whole thing. Uh, but and also there are also one a kind of enablers जो भी उनके narratives को या जो भी उनको suit करता है, they give visibility to that thing only. Like I remember there was this one meeting, this feminist meeting with trans people, kind of a meeting was there. जिसमें we also went, and because me and my friend Ritvik, we had, I mean, lack of the words, I have to say cis passing. We have good cis passing. So when we were entering that whole meeting, so in the registration section हमको बोला गया था कि आप 400 रुपए दीजिए आपको मीटिंग एंटर करने के लिए, and we were like कि मतलब हमारे लिए मीटिंग है तो हमसे क्यों पैसे मांग रहे हैं आप. And so that was a little weird for us. And then in that meeting also there was this one woman, I would not name the person, but she was like कि मुझे जेंडर न्यूट्रलिटी समझ में नहीं आती है, समझ में नहीं आती है. And then we were like कि मतलब इतना बड़ा एनजीओ है, थोड़ा गूगल कर लो. Anyway, that's about it. But also, when we come to LGBT community also, the whole cis people control all the power and the resources, most of them they do. And when it comes to trans people, especially trans men, हमको टोकनिज्म के तरीके से बुला लिया जाता है. And मतलब बुला तो लेते हैं, but then the thing is that I'm the only trans man there speaking about my issues, but मुझे सुनने वाला कोई नहीं है, because nobody is interested in listening to my issues, and there are like 30 trans women talking about their issues. I think how we can resolve or resolve this thing is because of, I think equal representation is very important. बट इक्वल रिप्रेजेंटेशन भी ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि सिर्फ आप नाम का इक्वल रिप्रेजेंटेशन कर रहे हैं. पावर रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूशन भी होना चाहिए उसके साथ साथ. एंड आई गेस सिस पीपल नीड टू स्टेप बैक when it comes to trans issues and trans things. And most of the time it happens कि trans लोगों के लिए meeting हो रही है, even with government officials जब trans लोगों के लिए meetings होती हैं, I think 95% लोग तो उसमें cis बैठे होते हैं. So I think people need to step back from these things and let trans people speak about their issues.
So, I was going to ask about your, like, again, the point that you said about how a lot, whenever one is talking about the trans rights movement, and this is something that if I were to share something and be vulnerable and share something slightly personal, is I have found this to be a gap even in what I'd like to believe is my process of doing work or bringing out stories, is that one often ends up speaking to trans women, and even within the trans rights movement there is intersectionality within that movement, and there's a narrow perception even to what trans persons are supposed to look like. So can you elaborate a little bit, जैसे आपने कहा that there are some experiences that you've had that don't get spoken about, or they're very tokenistically spoken about. So can you elaborate a little more on some interesting or unique experiences you've had as a trans man in your feminist activism?
How did Transmen Collective come into place? Was it also because of the frustration that, that these spaces usually have either has cishet people or have trans women in them, or was it just I mean, I would love to know how that came into place, given that we are talking about the social sector now, and there are such like I don't even know if there are any more such organizations who talk about, say, trans men's issues.
I think when I entered the feminist activism and this whole and also trans activism, so I came across few I would say stereotypes about trans men, and I believe these stereotypes are also something that hinders trans men to come out and speak or their activism in general. Well, the first of all, which from something that I heard was that all trans men are toxic and patriarchal. Second thing is कि they want to be invisible और वो visible नहीं होना चाहते हैं because they don't want to lose their male privileges. And third thing was कि trans men के partners के साथ काम करना चाहिए. Like I don't want to sound like that hashtag or not all men, but I know that eventually I'm going to sound like that only. So and I'm just trying to give it some insight. Uh, I mean, there are two reasons. One, of course, we have lived 90% of our life getting discriminated, harassed, and finally getting acknowledged for our gender and getting that so called power. And mostly people don't want to lose it. And second of all, this invisibility also gives a sense of safety because at the end of the day, we are female assigned of birth. And लोगों को पता चलेगा कि आप trans man हैं, तो there are a lot of chances of getting harassed and getting violated. Uh, and sometimes invisibility gives us that, and moreover life journey to get that power, people become patriarchal, and sometimes people do make conscious choices to break that notion and sometimes they don't. And also because this insecurity is that we are not man enough and people become toxic because our manhood do get questioned a lot by everyone in the name of not being able to make a woman pregnant or not having a penis and so on. uh, And then there are a lot of queer cis women who talk about key forming support groups or for partners of trans men. But so I was having this conversation with one of my partners who's a therapist, and she was like कि support groups उनके लिए बनाए जाते हैं who are survivors or who have some kind of issues and things like that. But I don't think trans men are the problem. If a partner is not able to understand the dysphoria or any part of the trans man's life, they're supposed to talk to trans men rather than forming a support group. Uh, and coming to the trans movement, when we talk about this confidence gap which women have, same goes for trans men also. Being female assigned birth, most of us face patriarchy, and always society made us feel like that we are not good enough and we need approval from male assigned births. And on the contrary, male assigned at birth had these privileges and hence entitlement. So yeah, they do end up occupying a lot of space in trans activism.
So, Jamal, like you mentioned, that say things like not being able to get a woman pregnant, and even in general, this body dysmorphia that people dysphoria, sorry, um, and in general, this body dysphoria that a lot of trans people experience is a very, very important conversation that brings a lot of nuance on the table. And here is where I want to address, and because we are talking about how cis people can be, say, made allies to the trans rights movement. So we often find that cis heteronormative language is a very, very big problem, even with respect to a lot of privileged spaces, especially when we're talking about health and SRHR. And um, and and a lot of trans people have tried to intervene and tell and also school a lot of privileged cis hetero people about these nuances, but there is still a lack of sensitivity when it comes to the things that you have mentioned in your narrative. So usually, say, when we talk about things like periods or menstruation, we still find a lot of flack on the internet when we use the phrase people who menstruate rather than, say, women menstruating or women giving birth. And a lot of radical feminists come at us saying that, you should not put people who menstruate because women menstruate. So in your activism and in your experiences, how have you navigated this realm of SRHR and periods and menstruation and health in general? In I mean, what are the kinds of things that you get to hear, or even in general, trans men who you have talked to get to hear in their everyday?
I mean, to be very honest, it's very frustrating the when we talk about SRHR for trans men, because I mean, like, from Transmen Collective's perspective, we are trying our best to talk to, like, we had this conversation with a a brand which is that pads brand. So we tried कि हम उनसे बात करें, and they can also do something for trans men. Uh, so, and I remember one experience which I had in my life is that when I was I when I was I mean when I was going for surgeries. So because of some doctor suggested कि आपको gynecologist के पास भी जाना पड़ेगा about for checkups and all. Uh, okay, checkup and all. So we waited there for like around 2 hours, and it was very embarrassing for me because I was looking like a man, cis man, and then I was waiting for my checkup in gynecologist. I mean that hospital. And everybody was like कि ये लोग यहाँ क्या कर रहे हैं, इनके साथ कोई औरत भी नहीं है जो प्रेग्नेंट है या ऐसा कुछ है. So that was very embarrassing for me, and I hear this narrative many times जहाँ पे trans men को कोई भी problem होता है, तो it's very hard for us to find a gynecologist who is trans sensitive to at least see us, मतलब at least meet us. Most of them are like कि ये यहाँ क्या कर रहे हैं, ये आदमी यहाँ क्या कर रहा है. And like recently when I had UTI, I didn't know where to go. So it's very hard for us to navigate that space. So yeah, I believe there are a lot of awareness work that needs to be done in order to make it more inclusive.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, so SRHR is something that we keep talking about, and one really finds this sort of negative attitude and this sort of unwillingness to even try and understand what the other person is saying. Like it's just this sort of blanket, no, this is not okay. And I mean, and this is when we are just putting out content. So I uh, like, thank you so much for sharing that very personal story with us. So, um I'm gonna say a bit of a cliche. Am I allowed to say, like, if do I have your permission to say something that's a little cliched?
Sure. Yeah.
It's a new year, and even though nothing has really changed, but when it comes to hope, some people do make resolutions for the upcoming year, and that can be to fight harder for yourself or for others, or to make spaces more inclusive and intersectional, make our speech and our writing more inclusive and intersectional. So do you have any resolutions for your feminist activism? What are the main challenges for the trans community in India that you think really need our immediate attention?
Mm, I think for my feminism activism, like I have this strange conundrum. I mean, ऐसा पहले नहीं था, but it has been, it developed over the years with my experiences with feminists. So my experiences with the so-called जो बड़े बड़े feminists होते हैं, has not been very great, to be very honest, who claims to be trans aware and trans friendly. And most of these feminists preaching about queer feminism are the ones who are harassing or discriminating against trans men. And also, it's very interesting to see how one who's being harassed doesn't hold any power. So, my ethical conundrum is that, do I still believe in feminism or not? So, I won't say resolution. So, it's a journey for me in this year to figure out that whole thing for me. I think so. In recent years, there's a lot of work that has happened, but there's a lot of scope of work that needs to be happening in the future or right now. So जैसे social structure है, economical structures है, education है, jobs है. For instance, जब आप school में होते हैं, the uniform is the first problem which we have. Then the discrimination in the school from the administration, teachers, students not understanding what the child is going through or what the child is saying. Families हैं, families में acceptance नहीं है. Then society में भी कोई acceptance नहीं है. Then jobs नहीं मिलती हैं, पढ़ाई में problem होती है. People drop out of college, schools, a lot of because of discrimination, there are a lot of people who are dropping out from these things. Then jobs में problem होती है because of the documents जो match नहीं करते हैं. And then confidence भी lack कर जाता है लोगों का कि इस सवाल का जवाब कैसे दें कि अब पहले तो ये नाम था, अब ये नाम है, या gap क्यों है. सो एंड जस्ट अ जनरल थिंग, जब हम किसी को बोलते हैं कि हाँ भाई हम ट्रांसजेंडर हैं, तो लोगों के दिमाग में तो यही आता है कि हाँ भाई हिजड़ा है या छक्का है या ऑल दीज काइंड ऑफ थिंग्स. So these are the, I mean according to me these are the challenges. And policies में तो खैर बहुत सारे challenges हैं. Reservations जिसकी I feel is a must need for trans people, जिसका कोई mention नहीं है. And these challenges also come from intersectional view. I mean, just say, for instance, somebody who is a Dalit trans man, who they would face a lot of more challenges than anybody from upper caste would face. So, in that sense, also we need to work in government sector या कभी को जो भी policy making कर रहे हैं, rather than just कि हमें policy बनानी है.
I think Jamal talked us through the entire idea around intersectionality and the importance of it. Something that Nishta and I both have been talking about since the first episode, and how intersectionality is not a simple or an easy thing to talk about. Because we need to understand as people that the trans community in itself also has power hierarchies and unequal representation issues. But when a particular group of people is a minority and there is such less sensitivity to their issues and there's such less solidarity around their demands, then to engage into the nuance then becomes even more of a challenge. So like Jamal rightly pointed out again about how trans people are not just trans people are also Muslims, trans people are also Dalits, and their demands are not just with respect to the trans rights, but they also demand reservations. They also demand they do they also face a lot of violence, communal violence, when it comes to their everyday life. So yeah, so and as people outside, say, the trans community, we need to educate ourselves. Like Jamal said, we should just, if we are not aware of something, we should not always rely on the trans community to educate and school us, because that is itself can become a burden on them. So we can, there is so much information on the internet, so we can just google it up and then and try to find sources which are reliable, and become better allies to really understand the hostility against the trans community and make space for their representation. So I think that is something that Nisha and I, again, we have tried our best to cover in our podcast season, and I think Jamal gave a really good conclusion to all these episodes and whatever we were trying to stress from the first till this episode.
Thank you, Jamal, so much for taking out the time to speak with us today. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show. Do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners?
Um, Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's been great. Uh, I think as I forgot who said what, but somebody said ki it's not our responsibility to educate the whole society, but it's very, क्योंकि हमारे ऊपर भी हजार बर्डन होते हैं, मतलब we have a lot of things to deal with. It would be nice if people can read about these things themselves for a change.
Absolutely. And on that note of educating ourselves and as privileged, as understanding our privilege and making use of that privilege to help disseminate information, I just want to say I'm very overwhelmed, but bring to an end the first season of Intersectional Feminism Desi Style. Just a shout out to all of our listeners who have stuck around for so long. Thank you so much for listening in. And a massive shout out to my co host Pragya, who unfortunately will not be joining us next season, but nonetheless is amazing and is going to do great things. So, Pragya, thanks. Also, just again, thank you for listening in. We are not going to be back next Thursday, but we will be back very very soon with the second season, where we're going to be breaking down even more feminist concepts, trying to bring to the fore more lived experiences, and really talking about intersectional feminism, as always, Desi style. For those of you who are listening and for those of you who've been with us this season, thank you so much for all your time. And as always, thanks so much for tuning in.